the way we've been able to merge adult ed and career and tech ed, and ways that other states only dream about. That we work collaboratively together, that we have this many people at the conference who are from same institutions, but in the past didn't work together, and now we've blended those, the priorities that the institutions have for both career and tech ed with adult ed. And the most important thing is that some of those changes, I would like to think all of those changes, have had a great impact on students. That has helped many of those adult ed students move into career and tech ed programs that wouldn't have had those opportunities before. All of you are responsible for that. We have ICCB staff that have worked very hard and are very responsible for that. But another person who is responsible for that is Maria Flynn. Through Jobs for the Future, she brought us together. And many of you know about ICAPS, you should all know about ICAPS. And ICAPS would not have existed in Illinois. We would not have been able to blend the work that we're doing, increase our successes, if it had not been for our involvement with Jobs for the Future and the Accelerating Opportunity Grant that we received. And that was kind of the catalyst for everything. And Maria was very responsible for that. She led the charge. The Jobs for the Future staff were phenomenal. They held our hands the whole way. There was a lot of leadership at Jobs for the Future and also kind of trickled down to the states that were participating. So thank you, Maria, for all that work that you did in that initiative as well as others. Thank you for the work that you continue to do, and I know you will enjoy hearing from her and hearing about the latest and greatest things that are happening. So without further ado, Maria Flynn.
Thank you. That's right. Great. Hi, good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. Thanks, Karen, for the introduction, and I just want to thank the whole team for inviting me to be here today. So I'm with Jobs for the Future, and just a little bit about us, building on what Karen said. So we are a national nonprofit organization that has been around for 35 years. So back when we were founded in 1983, even back then we were thinking about, the work of the future of work, what those jobs and those skills were going to be. So in a lot of ways, I think, today our mission is, more important than ever. And so what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about how we're thinking about the future of work and how I would encourage you to think about it in the context of your jobs. Then to back up a little bit and talk about what is the economic situation that we are seeing today and what does that mean for the students we serve, and then kind of wrap up with some next steps and some things to think about as you go through your 2 days together. But as Karen said, we've got a wonderful partnership with the state of Illinois, going back probably more than a decade. I know the whole time I've been at JFF, we've worked really closely with Karen and Jennifer and Brian, and it's you all should be really, really proud of everything that you have done. And at the beginning of Karen's remarks, she talked about how you've come a long way over the past 16, 17 years since you started this convening. And in preparing for this session, I was really reflecting on the decade that I've had the fortunate ability to work with you. You've really come a long way and are really a leader in the nation, as she said. So a lot to be proud of. And so what I would suggest for today, we kind of think about, so what's next, right? We've done a lot of great things. We have implemented a ton of reforms. We've aligned a lot of projects. We've brought programs together. So what's the next horizon look like? What are we going to work towards next? And so I think that's what's exciting, I think, about being here at this point in time. So when we think about the future of work, one thing that has frustrated me a bit is you hear lots of reports and lots of stories about the robots are going to take our jobs and lots of doom and gloom projections, right? And so I would recommend that we kind of back up from that a bit, like kind of back off the ledge and think a little bit about, what are the trends that are happening. So absolutely, automation is changing everything. My husband and I went to the movies not that long ago in downtown Boston, and it was this totally automated movie theater, right? Like you used kiosks for everything, for buying your ticket and for ordering your popcorn and everything. There was all automated. And my husband was fumbling around and getting very frustrated trying to order things, and he finally said, I am not a man of the future. And I was thinking, no, that's probably true. But it was a good wake-up call that even, in that moment, the change in a simple thing like how you enter a movie theater was dramatically different, than we would have seen 6 months prior, right? And so just a little example of how this is going to change our daily life. In that context, there were still workers there, but the workers were there helping people like my husband try to figure out how to use the technology, right? They were not selling the tickets. They were kind of, helping frustrated people with the kiosk technology. We also know that employment status is really shifting, right? So we know that the whole gig economy is growing. It's not just Lyft and Uber drivers. It's also, we're seeing it more in the home care space with platforms like care.com. We're starting to see, lots of companies starting to use more and more contract workers rather than your traditional full-time employees. So how do we think of that as we serve students, especially given there's a lot of complexity around federal performance standards, right, and how you count folks who might be 1099 employers. And then the change is happening faster and faster, and I think that's a theme that I'll try to touch on throughout these remarks, is the ability and the need for us to be agile in how we're thinking about designing our programs, our curriculum, and how we're serving students. A few of kind of statistics just to kind of put it in place. So various reports from McKinsey, from Brookings, from lots of organizations, they're saying that up to 11 million US workers might be replaced by automation in the coming years. 83% of jobs that pay less than $20 an hour are at risk of automation. So again, for those of us, serving adult education students, lower skilled students, in some ways they are more at risk than others. So I think that's why it's important to pay attention to this. But globally, almost 30% of all jobs have the risk of being automated, and in the US alone, about 47% of jobs are at risk of automation by 2034. So again, not to be a doom and gloom person, because that's not how I am, but it's just kind of important to think, these changes are in fact coming, and so how do we think about skills and training? So at the same time, there's lots of shifts continuing at the federal level. The good news is that Perkins was reauthorized, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But at the same time, I think we can unfortunately count on the lack of huge influxes of dollars right in the near future, right? So we have to unfortunately get used to this situation of kind of doing more with less and really driving towards efficiency. And then we're also at JFF, we're really looking very closely at the issue of wages and the kind of the wealth disparity that's growing in the country and how we think about that in terms of our work. And in the end, really looking to really calling out the moonshot of our time as driving towards a future in which automation, economic mobility, and dignified work are equal partners in the American dream. And so in the context of all the future work discussions, I like to think about, at JFF, our mission is to serve lower skilled young people and adults and help them attain post-secondary credentials and move into family sustaining careers. So very aligned with the work that you all do. And how do we, as we move towards this future of work, do we really dial in on that intersection between the future of work and economic mobility and start to take action now to ensure that the populations that we care the most about do not get further left behind as these changes occur? So, You know, I met with someone last week who was talking about blockchain and the impact that that's going to have, for example, on auditors. And he is a professor out in California, and he gave the example that currently, say there's a large audit with a corporation that might take 320 auditors. And he was saying, you know, that as automation starts to kick in and blockchain and the technology that comes along with that, that team of 320 auditors will become a team of 8 auditors. And so, again, kind of just the dramatic shifts that are likely to happen, and how do we be prepared for that? So, again, I think about let's be proactive, not reactive, right? So let's kind of start now to think about how do we build these agile systems. I also think, you know, there's a lot of discussion, particularly out like in Silicon Valley and the kind of the tech world, about things like universal basic income, right? So the idea that jobs are going to go away, so we should pay everyone a universal basic income. Again, I think personally, that's a fine thing to talk about. I don't think it's particularly realistic, and to me that's like skipping like 20 steps of the equation, right? So let's not just assume the jobs are going to go away. Let's, again, let's not abandon the work that we're doing. Instead, really, let's adapt the work that we're doing and position it for the future. And then too, it's like why I joined JFF originally almost 11 years ago was that, you know, we're kind of a think and a do tank, right? So we do a lot of research, we publish a lot of things, but we also really pride ourselves on taking action, and the work that we've done with you over the years I think is a great example of that. And so I think when we're thinking about the future, let's not just like wring our hands, but actually start to think about like how are we going to make a difference. So with that context though, I'm gonna like switch gears a little bit and talk about what's our labor market look like now, right? So that's the future. Those are the trends that everyone's pointing to. But the story today actually is a little different, right? And I was thinking about this morning. It's almost hard to keep these two realities in your head at the same time. At least I was finding that early this morning. Because today we hear a lot about skill shortages, right? We hear about the fact that there are more job postings than there are workers available, right? So we hear the jobs are going to go away, but for right now, there's more jobs than we can fill. And so how do we kind of rationalize this? Nationally, you know, unemployment rate is very low, right? Below the full unemployment, you know, so around 3.9% nationally. Employers have been adding jobs for over 92 straight months. I think that number is probably even higher now, right? So in a lot of places, the economy is growing and it's booming. And there's a lot of things that are great about that. In Illinois alone, there's been more than 1 million job postings online in the past year, right? So a lot of growth. And the unemployment here in this state is just it's about a little over 4%, so not that much higher than the national average. But you know, I think we all know though that that's not the whole story. And I like this report that came out in May by the Federal Reserve quite a bit. And there was an article in The Hill that came out kind of summarizing this report. And it talked about the fact that this report characterizes two nations barely cohabitating within the same border. So like this picture of the haves and the have-nots. And you know, the fact that when the news stories really highlight low unemployment and everything's great, my real concern is that glosses over the reality that so many of our students and our workers are living day in and day out. And so I think that's really the point that I kind of want to drive home here. And I'll just walk through a few of the statistics. So for example, 1 out of every 4 workers in the US lives below the poverty level. So one in 4. At the same time, so if you take a Hispanic family of 4, half of them, 50%, are making less than $50,000 a year. So that's nationwide. Family of 4, less than $50,000 a year. For African American families, that's 40%, and for white families, it's 20%. So we see obviously an equity issue here. We also see the fact that while people are working, and the unemployment rate may be low, that they are not earning enough to get by. And so in cities like Chicago, like DC, like Boston, it costs about $30,000 a year to rent an apartment. And so you have families of four trying to get by on $50,000 a year. And again, I think the 50% for the Latino family statistic was really staggering to me. And then again, we know we have an issue of wages. So low-wage worker wages continue to fall. They've fallen 6% in recent years. The share of national income held by middle-class households has decreased to 43%. So that's the first time that the middle class actually has less than half of the national income. And the middle class wages have only grown 5%. So we have a real wage disparity issue nationwide. So again, we've got these different things happening, right? We know the economy is booming in a lot of ways. We know that unemployment is low in a lot of ways. We know that employers need workers, and we know that there are specific skill sets that need to be addressed, right? And so to us at JFF, more and more, we're starting to talk about what we call the untapped workforce. And this is something I would encourage all of you to kind of think this way as well. So for example, while the Illinois unemployment rate is about 4%, if you look deeper into what is the BLS calls the U6 rate, so it's the folks who have also kind of given up looking for work and so on, that percent for Illinois right now is somewhere between 8 and 9%, right? So the statistics, I think, kind of gloss over the issue. I think we also have a lot of folks who are in the labor market but are in dead-end jobs. We also have a lot of workers who are working, 2 or 3 jobs to get by. So how do we really kind of pull the layers back from the onion and really start to look at, what are the situations of these individuals and how best do we design services to meet their needs, right? So it's a little different than 10 years ago, right, after the Lehman Brothers crash, right? Or I think it was just 10 years ago, a couple weeks, like last week, where folks were not working, right? We had lots of unemployed individuals, folks who were able to go back to school full time and get retrained. This is a very different situation, in my opinion, because folks, by and large, are working. And then also, like what came up with a meeting on the Hill we had a few weeks ago where we brought some state leaders in to talk to congressional staff, is that the folks who remain out of the workforce, who really are captured in that, whether the 4% rate or the 8% rate, are likely harder to serve than, folks who were unemployed 10 years ago, right? So what different strategies then do we need to incorporate to really activate that untapped workforce? So for JFF, you'll be hearing more from us over the, months ahead around this theme of untapped workforce, and how do we really think about our various strategies around engaging folks who have been involved with the justice system, ex-offenders. How do we talk about older workers? How do we talk about work with opportunity youth? How do we engage individuals with disabilities? So folks who, I think a lot of times in federal law get characterized as the special populations, and how do we really start to think about them as, untapped talent that we should be excited to be mobilizing and help them find career pathways that can support their families. So when we look kind of at this topic, in a way we're seeing it as a nation within a nation, because there are about 90 million adults in the US that don't have a credential beyond high school. So this is a pretty significant number, and we know from work that Tony Carnevale has done at the national level that almost 90% of jobs being created today require some education and training beyond high school, right? So a big mismatch. We know that 44 million people struggle to feed their families, and if you thought about this 90 million number, it would be the 15th largest nation in the world, right? So it is a significant number of workers that we're talking about. And so we really feel if the US is truly to be the land of opportunity, and if we are really to truly achieve equity, then we need to get our nation's untapped talent engaged, educated, and employed. And one thing that, kind of in terms of progress over the years, I have seen, particularly in the past 18 to 24 months, that employers are, I would say on average more open to this, more open to talking about kind of new strategies to finding talent than I've seen before. So I think that in a lot of ways, how do we seize this moment where employers are eager for talent and we have talent that we're working to mobilize, and use this really as the time to act and get employers engaged in new ways, and then hopefully keep them engaged when the business cycle turns again. So I want to switch a little bit to kind of what's ahead. Before I do that, maybe just a note a little bit, because we're going to talk a little bit about some of the stuff happening at the federal level and so on. So a little bit about my background. So before coming to JFF, I was with the U.S. Department of Labor for about 16 years, so quite a while. I was there from 1991 to 2007, so everything from the SCANS report, the JTPA amendments, the Workforce Investment Act, lots of things during that time, the WIRED initiative, where I know we had a couple sites in Illinois. But kind of my passion for this work goes back farther than that. So when I was growing up, my mother actually worked for what was then called the voc ed system in New Jersey. She was the office manager of the voc ed school in our little town in New Jersey, a pretty rural town at that time. They had 3 classrooms. They had automotive, they had beauty culture, and they had distributive education. So those were the classrooms, and I was little, and so I used to go there every day before school until my school started. So in a way, since I was in 4th grade, that was, a big part of my life, was sitting in that school every morning and getting to know the students and the teachers, and that's really how I grew up. And then, oddly, my father worked for the New Jersey Department of Labor on workforce development issues and did a lot around unemployment insurance and some of the early work around one-stop centers. And so I kind of grew up in this world, and then to me it was only logical when graduating from college to go work for the U.S. Department of Labor. So my passion is really around systems and efficiency and alignment. So I went to JFF because I really saw it as a place that is not about protecting systems or the status quo, or really about helping people and driving innovation to make that happen. So, I'll talk a little bit about how, I do think that, again, we're making great progress both as a nation, Illinois as a state, and kind of like, what do we need to do from here? So one is, to continue to think about college and career pathways that are really one and the same. And I know you've done a lot of that here in Illinois. And to make sure that, we're really putting young people and adults on a path that is truly, gives them solid options, right? Whether they decide to go into the workforce, whether they decide to go into post-secondary, if they decide to kind of switch back and forth, whatever that might be, how are we laying this out in a really constructive way? Because we know that right now, too few people are completing post-secondary degrees and credentials. That's, I would say, youth and adults. We know that high schools, while the graduation rates are improving, we know that there's still significant transition issues between high school and post-secondary. We know that fields like STEM, but many others, are struggling to find employees, as I talked about. And we know that more and more that careers are going to require post-secondary education. So, I love the fact that here in Illinois, that Karen and the team, that you're really seeing adult education as the foundational piece of those comprehensive career pathways, right? Because to me, that is exactly how it should be. It shouldn't be something off to the side. It's really the foundation upon that all this is built upon. And as you know, Perkins was reauthorized, so a rare bipartisan effort these days coming out of DC. So again, I think it's an opportunity to take advantage of this. So again, to really think about how do you use this as an opportunity to even further enhance the quality of your programs, how you can kind of further strengthen the connections to adult education beyond what you've done already, to really take advantage of the flexibility that states will have in terms of how they're using their resources, right? So really kind of try to lean in and take advantage of all of that is presenting to you. I liked Karen's example about how at one point you went through a process to really look through, what were the federal barriers, what are the state barriers, and so on. Years ago, it was probably during the Clinton administration, I was part of a team that went out to Oregon as part of something then that was called the Oregon Option. And it was all about how you give states more flexibility. And I'll never forget, they had a room almost this size with Post-its all over with all of the requirements that they wanted the feds to remove. Just lists upon lists upon lists of all of the, between education and workforce and human services. And so they sent myself and other feds in, to kind of be the team on the ground. And as we went around, it was something like 90% of the stuff on the wall actually weren't federal requirements. They were state or local requirements. And that's something that has stuck with me now for like 25 years because it was staggering, and just kind of the myths in that room, like the ability to go through and actually myth bust, like, no, the feds actually don't say that, that's your rule. And even though that was 25 years ago, I think we still see that in a lot of cases, and I'm a little further removed from the federal stuff than I used to be, but I would really encourage you to as Karen said, keep looking at that issue. How do you kind of get out of your own way on some of these things and really take advantage of all the flexibility that's there. The other things in the CTE bill is there's a greater emphasis on data-driven decision-making. And states are going to be developing their plans in consultation with many stakeholders, right? So I would use this as an opportunity to really get fully involved and engaged. There's increased attention to serving, again, special populations, which I would go back to the untapped workforce. So how are you really engaging these folks who have been left on the sidelines during the economic recovery? Really driving alignment, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. And there's also going to be a new competitive grant program around innovation. I think we're still waiting for more details on that. But so again, kind of use this opportunity with a new piece of legislation and new requirements to step back and think about, okay, where do we build on our success in order to take the state to the next level? And then yesterday, we actually announced something called the $1 Billion Wage Gain Challenge. So this is something that we are, at JFF, we're doing in partnership with Eric Schmidt and his foundation, Schmidt Futures. So back to the issue around wages and the fact that even though the unemployment rate is down and folks are working, we know that folks are struggling from low wages. So we launched a challenge where we're looking for specific ideas, initiatives, programs that will increase workers' wages by $10,000 a year. So we're calling it kind of the $1 billion unicorn for the middle class. Raise 100,000 workers' wages each by $10,000 a year. So if you have ideas around that, I encourage you to go to our website and submit them. We're going to be taking ideas, I believe, like kind of through Thanksgiving, and then making some announcements of winners early next year. So I encourage you to look at that. And so before, I mentioned, Tony Carnevale's research that talks about, over 90% of jobs requiring post-secondary education and training. In Illinois, that number right now is about 70%, so still, pretty significant. And, I would say that you are really well positioned for this. I just want to, really commend you on the 5-year strategic plan for adult education. I looked at it again over the past couple days, and the fact that it it really is geared towards the future of work and the changing nature of work and what is coming ahead. It really sets ambitious goals. And I think it really builds upon the success that you've had, back many years, both through Accelerating Opportunity that Karen mentioned, which is ICAPS for all of you, and even back to some of the shifting gears work that you did with the Joyce Foundation early on. So I think that this plan really well positions you for the changes that are coming up. And again, just the kind of the strategic focus on, again, this kind of two issues that we have, right? The issue that work is changing, jobs are changing, but at the same time, like, employers need workers now, right? And I think the plan does a good job of dealing with that. It talks a lot about upskilling. It talks about, the need to really scale comprehensive career pathways and having more integrated education and training with a focus on jobs. And so I think those all are terrific. I think, so, to touch on the alignment piece again, so it's, it's never simple, right? It's like, not only is it the integration of adult ed and career and technical education, but I think it's important to think about, what's happening with the K-12 system. How do we align those efforts? How do you align with the public workforce system and the one-stop centers around the state and the resources that run through there, your economic development funds, and the community-based organizations, right? Because in order for all this to work, these resources all need to be aligned. And I think it's also important for folks to really kind of play to their strengths, which is something I talk about a lot, because I think particularly when you have funding streams that have similar allowable activities, I think it's really important to kind of step back and say, who should be playing what function, who is best positioned to play that function. So, like, for example, with engaging employers, I think you want to be sure that you don't have multiple programs chasing after the same employers, right? Because that's just going to turn people off. So how can you design interventions where you have a coordinated, comprehensive approach to that type of employer engagement? Because I think, kind of worst case scenario is you have adult ed knocking on a door, then a CTE program, and then the K-12 folks come, and then the workforce board shows up, right? And all within the same regional labor market. So how can you really kind of align those efforts in a coordinated way? And I will say that, like, at JFF, we have the same issues at times, so I'm certainly not saying it's easy, right? So how do you kind of break down your silos so that it's seamless to the customers you're trying to serve, both the students and the employers? Another theme that we see, over the years is the need for acceleration, because we know that time is really the enemy of most students. My husband, the same guy who had trouble with the automated movie theater, he, in a lot of ways, is a great example of an adult learner, right? He is someone who got his 2-year degree years ago, recently decided he wanted to go back and get his 4-year degree. At the same time, he stays home with our kids so that I can be here and other places. And he is finding it really difficult to take, more than 1 or 2 courses a semester, right, while doing all of that. And that's someone who, where I'm working, he's home, it's still hard for him to balance all of that. And so if you take that to, other examples, I think he's on pace to maybe, like, finish the rest of his credits in, like, 6 years or something, right? So this is like the slow train to the 4-year degree. And for someone who is trying to, support their family, the slow train is not going to work, right? It works well for us. It works great for my husband. It is not going to work great for someone who is, being counted on to support their family. So how do we get folks through faster? And I know you all know this better than I do, but it was, again, about 10 years ago when I first came to JFF, I was really struck by meeting with a woman who was teaching adult basic ed at a community college in Washington State. And she was explaining to me, and I'll admit I did not know this before talking with her, that some of their students were taking 6 to 8 semesters of courses before really even getting to the starting line, right? They were taking semester after semester of adult basic ed or dev ed before even getting to their first college level course. And so in a lot of ways that put me on a personal path to take on work like Accelerating Opportunity that we've done so well with your state and a lot of other efforts that we have at JFF, which is really about how do you get folks to the finish line faster? How do you meet people where they are? How do you work efficiently with other programs to make this easy for folks? How do you engage employers to have earn and learn models that work? And so ICAPS is a terrific example of that, and I encourage you to keep up the great work and continue to scale that project. Things like early college, high school, and dual enrollment between K-12 and community colleges are another great example of that acceleration. And I think any ways to look at things like competency-based learning, around skills-based assessment, where you can be filling in that exact skill gap and not sending someone off for 18 months of training if they just need to learn 2 or 3 new competencies is really key. So I would just continue to think about how time plays a role in all of this. And then just to mention briefly, because this is another way that JFF is involved in Illinois, is through work around the Post-Secondary and Workforce Readiness Act. And our role here has been working with teams from your state around developing competency standards. So again, kind of looking at how do you map what employers are really looking for to the endorsements that are going to be rolling out as part of this legislation. And again, kind of a great opportunity to merge, what is being taught in the classroom with what's being required in the world of work, and really mapping that together in a coherent fashion. And so this, again, I think, even though it may not impact your kind of day-to-day work directly, I would encourage you to kind of follow it, because again, it's an example of where employers are being talked to about their skill needs, and that's going to be relevant whether you are, kind of from a K-12 perspective, an adult ed perspective, career and tech ed's perspective. Those skill needs are going to be the same. And so how do we, how to look at that in a unified way? And then I think just in general, and this builds from a post that one of our staff members put up a few weeks ago around high quality and equitable CTE programs. So again, just some things to keep in mind. I would say, how are you building connections between secondary and post-secondary career and tech ed, right? How well is that working? Are there things that could be done better? I think that career advising is going to be increasingly critical. So I already think that by and large our nation does a pretty terrible job of career advising. But I think as we move towards the future of work and the fact that new occupations are being created all the time that no one has heard of before, how do we really help students, parents, workers know what the opportunities are and what are the pathways to get there? My 8th grader, now 9th grader, often tells me, she knows what I do for work, and she often tells me, we don't learn anything about jobs at school. And it's like, that's unfortunate, but it's true, right? It's like it's not happening the way it should, and how do we do a better job of that now? And then how are we, along with kind of the career advising piece, how are we also advising on education requirements and transfer requirements so that folks don't kind of inadvertently get to a dead end? And again, like back to my husband's example, like watching him go through trying to get all of his credits transferred and everything was pretty painful. And again, that's, and that was with me trying to help him through it. And so how do you kind of get ahead of that and make sure that folks are aware of the requirements and the hurdles and the options up front. So one report that I just wanted to kind of on that point, just point you towards on our website, called When is a Job Just a Job and When Can It Launch a Career? Because I think as a field, and I say this as someone who's been part of the field my whole career, so I include myself in this statement, like as a field, I think sometimes we talk about generalities, right? We talk in general about pathways, and we talk in general about stackable credentials, and we talk generally about, folks advancing along, their career. And my concern is that we don't spend enough time really diving into what does that look like, right? What does the pathway really entail? And are people moving along it, right? Or is it just a diagram on a piece of paper, right? How do we kind of get more into the weeds of what's happening? And so I love this report because it does just that. What we did is we worked with Burning Glass, which is a real-time labor market information company, and our team did a deep dive of 4 million resumes, so data coming out of 4 million resumes across the country, and actually did an analysis of what jobs lead to better jobs and which ones don't. So kind of plain and simple, how can you use kind of this growing kind of big data as a way of figuring that out? And so we put jobs into 3 categories, and I'll just go through it really quickly, but I just encourage you to look at the report, because I think to me it was really interesting. So the first category is what we were calling lifetime jobs, and these are jobs like dental hygienist. So it's a job that is a kind of a middle skill job, and it's a job that's going to enable you to support your family. I was at the dentist last week, and my dental hygienist, she asked what I did for a living, and then she was telling me that she actually retrained to become a dental hygienist pretty late in her career, right? And so she made that option, went back and got some training, now loving her job. And so this is a good job where, because it's you're not most likely not going to go from dental hygienist to dentist, but that's okay because you're making a great living. Springboard jobs are a little different. These are jobs where the team actually found that they do lead to advancement. And so one example is human resource assistants. So that's a job, again, a good kind of entry-level job that has a high likelihood of career advancement potential. And then the third job is what we're calling static jobs. We are careful not to call them dead-end jobs. That's what the press called them when they picked up this report. We call them static jobs. And medical assistants, is an example of something we put in that category. And I know, I would say maybe 8-10 years ago, right? It seemed like there was a big push on let's train everybody to become medical assistants, right? Seemed like it was everywhere for a while. And what we're finding is that, they're not great jobs. They're not jobs that are going to move you up the career ladder. So again, just an example of a report that I think can give you some granularity and something tangible to think about in terms of what are these career pathways and what's really possible, and how have real workers moved through them. So I'm going to kind of move to wrap up. So I tried to think about, after all of this, what would I really recommend that you think about over the next 2 days. So first is, and again, this is something I think about a lot lately, because again, I think as a field, we've done a lot of great work, including with all of you, around getting folks to that first job and that first credential, right? I think there's a lot of great evidence base around those models, like accelerating opportunity, ICAPS, IBEST, so on. To me, the next kind of unexplored area, kind of getting back to what I just talked about with the resume data report, is, so what's next? How are we really helping individuals getting to the next job and the next credential? And what do those interventions need to look like? Does that mean there needs to be more employer engagement? Does that mean there needs to be more employer investment in those programs? Do we need flexibility at the federal level to provide more services to folks who are already working? Lots of questions there that I think are exciting to figure out, because I think in some ways we've solved, by and large, not perfect, but we kind of know how to get to the first job and the first credential now. And now it's like, so now what? Second is, and I know you touch on this in the Adult Ed Strategic Plan, which I thought was great, is how do we have an open mind about technology-based solutions, right? Because I know even within JFF over the years, there's sometimes some hesitancy around technology, and how do you know if one vendor is better than the next, and a lot of questions. And so I have really, taken the stand of let's lean into that, and let's, knowing that technology is the best way to scale solutions in many ways, how do we really take a deep look at how to best incorporate technology in our delivery? And so we've recently launched a new kind of sub-entity to JFF called JFF Labs, which is really designed to be a bridge in that regard, kind of a bridge between traditional delivery systems and tech-based delivery, and how can we help to kind of bring these conversations together? How can we help programs and states and systems make informed choices around what products to work with, and really to start to test more explicitly how well they work for harder to serve populations. An example of that is we've worked with a company called Persistence Plus for a couple years now. They're a text-based nudging app. So you have an app on your phone, and you're a community college student, and you sign up to get nudges. Like, have you registered for courses next semester? Have you met with your advisor recently? And so on and so forth. And we were able to we worked with 4 community colleges around the country. We ran an evaluation alongside of it, and found that for students in the STEM pathway, they were 10% more likely or to have semester-to-semester persistence than those who didn't use the app. So using the app, 10% higher semester-to-semester persistence than those students who didn't use the app. So to me, the more we can have that type of information on effectiveness of some of these products, then I think it starts to get really exciting, and we can help kind of turn down some of the signaling noise in the market. And then third is really continue to drive coordination, alignment, and efficiency. And again, Illinois, the way you have brought together adult ed and CTE is tremendous. And how do you kind of keep moving both kind of deeper on that coordination, and then also broader in terms of working with the public workforce system and so on. And so the 3 words I would leave you with then are awareness, right? How do we help build career awareness systems, education pathway awareness systems that can help students and workers? How do we continue to drive alignment? And then back to the, kind of the future of work that's ahead of us, how do we really ensure that we're being agile? Because I think agility is going to be key. We talk about that a lot internally at JFF these days as well. And just an example is I think we know within community colleges it can take a long time, right, to get a new course approved and to get things set up. And I think as we move to the future and employer needs are shifting faster and faster, the traditional systems are going to have to move faster and faster as well. And so how do we get kind of the foundations in place and the resources in place and the professional development opportunities in place to make that happen? So that brings me to the end. But it's just been terrific to be here with you. We love working with the state of Illinois and look forward to many more years of doing great things together. And I think we have some time for questions.
Hi, good morning. Yes. Brett Luther, Local Community College. wondering if you have any thoughts about the feasibility of preparing the untapped workforce to be entrepreneurs, to be
Yep.
contractors, to be a part of the gig economy.
Yep, I think that's a great question. So let's repeat it in case. So how do we think about preparing the untapped workforce to be entrepreneurs and to be active in the gig economy? And I think that's exactly right. So I know there is a group called Sama School out in the Bay Area that is training individuals to be effective gig workers. So I think that's a really interesting model, how to kind of training them on how to make the best decisions, kind of the trade-offs that they're going to be encountering. So I think that is terrific. I think also looking at how do we build entrepreneurialism into our curriculums is also key. So I think it's critically important, because I think in a lot of ways, the earlier that we can help folks understand that, again, the nature of work may be different as they move forward, the better.
Just really a curiosity question. How do you define the middle class? Remember those slides you referenced in the class? I'm just wondering kind of what that range is or whatnot you're trying to put it in context.
Yeah, so I tend to talk about like 200% of federal poverty, which is about the 50,000 a year, I think. So that's generally the threshold that I use, which I guess is similar to a lot of federal programs use.
Messages 8 minutes ago.
Could you please repeat the name of the model that the Bay Area was on?
Yeah, it's called Sama School, which I believe is spelled SAMMA School, and they're in San Francisco. Great.
I just wondered, this untapped workforce, or this untapped population, I'm at a community college, and I'm just wondering your advice in getting the rest of the college to see us as potential, not just a drain college,
Yep.
We've been trying so many ways, but I'd like to hear your advice on how to make them sit up and say, this is an adult population, not
Yep.
but they're considering the green and college ready. I don't know, we're like on a highway, we just can't get on there.
Yeah, and I think it's a great question, and I think it's, so when we've been talking just within JFF about how do we start to change the narrative around untapped workforce, we talk about roughly kind of an air campaign and a ground campaign, right? And so how do we get the message out, big picture, right? Kind of blare the message that, yes, while unemployment rates are low, there's still a huge problem in this country, right? And so I think with college leadership, I think that's a potential. And then I think in terms of the, ground game in that example, I know a lot of colleges are having decreased enrollments, right? So I think you could make a business case also to kind of get to the business and the money end to really think about, how can having, an on-ramp of adult learners and an on-ramp from adult ed really be a good business investment for them. So I would think of it doing two ways, kind of the big picture and then the brass tacks of money.
Maria?
Yeah.
You mentioned low enrollments, and community colleges and universities all over the country are struggling with that. And one of the reasons is demographics,
Yep.
just the demographics. What can we do, or is JFF addressing this problem in a new way in terms of helping the employers prepare for a diminishing workforce?
Yep. Yeah, so I think it's something we're spending a lot of time right now, because I think the employers are going to be increasingly important in this dialogue, and I've seen some encouraging shifts from some of the bigger corporations like Walmart or Best Buy or who else? Folks, JP Morgan Chase, folks who are, I think, starting to really realize that they have got to do business a little differently, like Google, Amazon, folks who are really thinking about how do they think differently about their entry-level workers. I think that continuing to encourage them, employers, to think about how are they using their training dollars, right? Because I think the statistic has gotten better over the years, but I know like 10 years ago, the statistic was something like 90% of all corporate training dollars were going to executive level training, and hardly anything was being invested in the front line. So I think looking more and more around how can we bundle corporate training and community colleges is going to be really important. And I think just, again, it's talking to employers about their business needs and mapping that back to investment strategies, I think, is going to be key.
So Maria, I'm wondering, what's the understanding level of the folks in the federal administration, labor, education, around this idea of the untapped workforce?
Yeah, so I will admit, I'm concerned about that. I am concerned that kind of within the executive branch, that the focus really is on the economy is great, right? And we hear a lot of that, right? And my concern is that they are not acknowledging the rest of the story and focused on the rest of the story. I think that what's coming out around apprenticeship is terrific, right? We're very supportive of that. What I have said to leadership there many times is, apprenticeship is just one tool in the toolbox, that we've got to be looking more broadly at solutions, that we've got to be looking at, how do we provide services to folks who are working but who are living in poverty. And frankly, that message isn't getting, across all that well. So I think that we have a lot of kind of, education and advocacy to do around these issues. I think it's also, it has been a bit challenging to get a real focus on automation and future of work. I think you either have folks who are kind of in denial, right, because they're more concerned about the fact that right now there's a skills gap and there's like not a lot of attention kind of being paid to the shifts. And then I think you have the camp that is more like, oh, we're going to have universal basic income and everything's going to be, roses. And my concern is there's not a lot of attention right now on practical action, which is where, I would rather have a focus.
Thank you. I saw something on television a few weeks ago about a big technological company, the name of which I can't think right now, but they decided that they needed to tap into the creativity of the pool of autistic people.
Oh, that's interesting.
Did you see that too? It was amazing. This company hired a group of autistic people and then gave them social supports, because that would be the challenge. They each got a mentor who helped them bridge the gap between themselves and the other workers. And they're doing it brilliantly. It's just really working. And I wonder about that model. Do you feel that there's something in there for people who are not in that autistic pool, but who are just more, other kinds of learners? And is there some way you see in the future that maybe GED students, or, other kinds of students without those higher degrees, without the brilliance, could maybe just be helped and mentored in the workplace?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's right on. And I know there's I don't know all the details, but I know there's a group that kind of started out in Stanford University where they talk about cool abilities. So it's to the point where for individuals with disabilities, individuals with autism, and how you really promote and support the skills that they bring to the workforce, right? And to have that be a cool factor rather than a deterrent. So I think hopefully we'll see more and more of that. I know when I was back at USDOL, there was a specific internship program that we worked with focused on students who had autism. And it was tremendous. I know we hired the student that we had full-time as a result, because it's like their ability and their eagerness to do some very specific jobs that, others on the staff, weren't interested in was tremendous. And so I think that we need to have kind of more nuanced look at those issues. And I also think that, in general, it's like we know that it's the routine jobs and skills that are at risk of automation, and it's the creativity jobs, the people skills, the 21st century skills are the things that are not going to be automated. So how do we kind of enable folks to really thrive kind of in that culture? So I think it's a great point. Yeah. Great. Well, thank you for having me, and I hope you have a great couple days together, and look forward to working with you more.